the 8th of May, 1945. Somewhere in Bavaria, southern Germany, the guns had finally fallen silent. Marguerite Schultz stood in the ruins of what had once been a military communications center, her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform filthy with dust and smoke. Around her, 24 other women telegraphists, nurses, administrative staff waited in terrified silence. They'd been told the Americans were coming. For 12 years, they'd heard stories about these soldiers. Degenerate mongrels from a bastard nation. Weak-willed men softened by jazz music and Hollywood excess. Cowboys and gangsters wearing uniforms, utterly lacking the discipline and strength of the German soldier. The propaganda had been relentless, thorough, absolute, and now, standing in the wreckage of the 1,000-year Reich that had lasted barely a dozen, Marguerite was about to discover just how thoroughly she'd been lied to. Before we dive deeper into this moment that shattered an empire built on deception, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, whether you're in Berlin, Chicago, or anywhere in between. This story needs to be heard. Because what these women experienced wasn't just shock. It was the complete demolition of a carefully constructed reality. The rumble of engines grew louder. Marguerite's hands shook. She'd heard what happened to women when armies arrived. The Russians in the east, the stories were unspeakable. Would the Americans be any different? Through the broken windows, she caught her first glimpse. Trucks, American trucks, enormous things, painted olive green, rolling through the demolished streets like they owned the world. And, emerging from them, Marguerite's breath caught. These weren't men. They couldn't be men. Not the men she'd been taught to expect. They were giants. To understand the absolute shock that paralyzed Marguerite and millions of German women like her, you need to understand the world they'd been raised in. Since 1933, every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every classroom lecture, every film had delivered the same message. Germany was strong, Germany was pure, and Germany's enemies, especially America, were weak, mongrelized, and decadent. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, had turned lying into an industrial process. American soldiers were portrayed as poorly trained rabble. Images showed slouching men with weak chins and bad posture. Cartoons depicted Americans as either effeminate city dwellers or backward rural hicks. The narrative was clear. These were not soldiers. They were civilians in costume, sent to die by Jewish bankers who controlled their government. German women were told that American men lacked discipline, lacked strength, lacked the warrior spirit that defined the true soldier. They were soft from excess, weakened by racial mixing, corrupted by capitalism's shallow pleasures. The American soldier, propaganda pamphlet declared, is a product of our decaying civilization. He fights not for honor or homeland, but for money. He will break at the first sign of real resistance. This wasn't random messaging. It was calculated psychological warfare designed to make Germany's position seem stronger than it was. If your enemy was weak, your own sacrifices made sense. If their soldiers were inferior, your husband's death had meaning. If their nation was crumbling from within, then victory was still possible, still inevitable. Marguerite had absorbed these messages since she was 13 years old. She'd joined the Bund Deutscher Medal, the Poseida Medal 10, League of German Girls at 14, attending weekly meetings where they sang patriotic songs and learned about German superiority. By 16, she was working in the postal service. By 18, she'd been recruited into military communications. She'd never questioned the narrative. Why would she? It came from every direction, confirmed by every authority, repeated until it became indistinguishable from reality itself. Helga Weber, a Red Cross nurse from Hamburg, had spent 3 years treating wounded soldiers returning from the Eastern Front. She'd watched boys younger than her die in agony, whispering about defending the fatherland from Asiatic hordes and Western degenerates. She'd believed them, believed their sacrifice mattered, believed Germany was fighting a righteous war against lesser peoples. The propaganda films shown in hospitals portrayed American troops as cowards who surrendered at the first opportunity. Goebbels' newsreels claimed American cities were torn apart by racial violence, their factories silent, their people starving. "We are told America is producing many aircraft," one of Helga's fellow nurses had said in late 1944, "but they must be inferior, quality, mass-produced garbage. German engineering will always be superior." Helga had nodded. It made sense. Quality over quantity, precision over waste. These were German values. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while German factories were being run by starving slave laborers producing ever smaller numbers of overcomplicated machines, American factories were pumping out thousands of reliable, effective weapons with assembly line efficiency that would have made German engineers weep. By May 1945, the United States had produced 300,000 aircraft. Germany had produced 119,000. But Marguerite and Helga and millions of other German women didn't know these numbers. They knew only what they'd been told. Germany was strong, the enemy was weak, and victory was a matter of will. Then the Americans arrived, and every lie shattered at once. The first American soldier Marguerite saw up close was a staff sergeant from Ohio named Robert Mitchell. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall. His shoulders filled the doorway of the communications center. His uniform, though dusty from travel, was intact, well made, properly fitted. His boots were leather, not the cardboard substitutes German soldiers had been wearing for the past year. His helmet sat at an angle that somehow managed to look both casual and professional, but it was his face that stopped Marguerite's breath. He looked healthy, not the gaunt, desperate health of a man, rationing his strength. Not the pallid complexion of someone surviving on ersatz coffee and potato peels. He looked fed, well fed. His cheeks had colour, his eyes were clear. His teeth, dear God, his teeth were white and straight when he smiled at the terrified women. "Anyone speak English?" he asked, his voice calm, almost gentle. Silence. He tried again, slower. "English? Anybody?" One of the younger women, Erica, raised a trembling hand. She'd studied English in school before the war made it forbidden. "Good," Mitchell said, still in that unnervingly calm tone. "Tell the others. Nobody's going to hurt them. We're just here to process you as POWs. Medical check, documentation, then transport to a camp. That's it," Erica translated, her voice shaking. The women exchanged glances. This had to be a trick. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were brutal, especially to brutal women. They were told to expect the worst. But Mitchell just stood there, patient, waiting. Behind him, more soldiers filed in, all of them tall, all of them healthy-looking, all of them moving with a casual confidence that seemed almost theatrical in its completeness. One soldier was chewing gum. Marguerite stared at him. Chewing gum. Like this was normal. Like he was bored, even. These men had just fought across France and Germany. They'd been in combat for months, and they looked like they'd just come from a Sunday picnic. Helga Weber had a similar experience 60 miles away, in a field hospital the Americans had just captured. The first American medic she saw was a woman, Lieutenant Sarah Thompson from Massachusetts. She walked into the hospital ward with 2 enlisted men carrying medical supplies, and Helga's first thought was that she must be lost. This couldn't be. A soldier. She was tall, taller than most German men Helga knew. Her uniform was clean, pressed, professional. She wore lipstick, actual lipstick. Her hair was styled beneath her cap. She moved with absolute authority, and the men with her clearly deferred to her rank. "Jesus Christ," Thompson muttered in English, looking around at the German wounded. "Get the sulfanilamide. And we need plasma. Lots of plasma." She switched to broken German. "We help. You understand? We help now." The German nurses stood frozen. Help? Why would the enemy help? But Thompson was already moving, checking patients, issuing orders. The American enlisted men set up equipment Helga had never seen before: portable IV stands, Boxes of medical supplies that seemed impossibly well stocked. One box fell open. Morphine syrettes scattered across the floor. Dozens of them. Helga stared. Germany had been desperately short of morphine for 2 years. Wounded soldiers often got nothing for pain except vodka or being told to bite a leather strap. These Americans had so much they could afford to drop an entire box. Thompson caught her staring. "Help me, please," she said in halting German. "Many patients need German nurses who know them." Helga moved automatically, her training overriding her confusion. She began translating patient conditions, while Thompson worked with swift, practiced efficiency. The American nurse's hands were steady. Her instruments were sterilized. She had actual antibiotics, penicillin, still largely unavailable in Germany, and she used them freely, generously, on German soldiers she'd been fighting against days earlier. "Why?" Helga finally asked in broken English. "Why you help?" Thompson looked up, surprised by the question. "They're wounded. That's my job. But to enemy. The war's over, honey. They're just patients now." It was said so matter-of-factly, so casually, that Helga felt something crack in her chest. These weren't the degenerates from the propaganda films. These weren't the weak, undisciplined rabble she'd been taught to expect. These were professionals. Healthy, well-equipped, confident professionals who treated medicine like it was abundant and enemy wounded like they were just another shift at the hospital. Over the following days and weeks, as German women POWs were processed and transported to detention camps, the revelations came in waves, each one more devastating than the last. The food broke them first. Margareta and her group were loaded onto American trucks and driven to a temporary POW processing center. They expected starvation rations, maybe thin soup, bread if they were lucky. What they received was a meal that made several women cry. White bread. Real white bread, soft and fresh, made from wheat flour without sawdust or bark filler. Canned meat spam, the Americans called it, sliced and fried. Powdered eggs, reconstituted and scrambled with actual butter. Coffee. Real coffee, not the roasted acorn substitute Germans had been drinking for years. And chocolate. Small bars of Hershey's chocolate, handed out like it was nothing. The portions were obscene. More food on a single plate than most of them had seen in a week. Marguerite held the chocolate bar like it was made of gold. In Germany, chocolate had vanished in 1942. Children born during the war had never tasted it. She unwrapped it slowly, and the smell hit her sweet, rich, impossibly decadent. She took a tiny bite, trying to make it last. The taste exploded across her tongue, and she couldn't help it. She started crying. Around her, other women were doing the same. Some ate slowly, reverently. Others devoured everything on their plates like animals, because that's what starvation does. It strips away dignity and leaves only desperate hunger. An American soldier, a young private from Iowa, watched them with obvious discomfort. "Sergeant," he called to his superior, "these women, when's the last time they ate?" "Probably days, Mitchell. Maybe longer. Germany's been starving for months." The private looked disturbed. "And we're just giving them regular rations?" "POW rations are the same as ours, minus the cigarettes. Geneva Convention. But that's more than they've had in years, probably. Not our problem what the Nazis did to their own people. Our job is to feed them properly now." Marguerite understood enough English to follow this exchange. The casual nature of it, the assumption that, of course, they'd be fed properly. That, of course, POWs deserved adequate nutrition was staggering. German POWs on the Eastern Front were worked to death on starvation rations. She'd heard the stories. And yet here, the Americans seemed almost annoyed they hadn't been fed properly by their own government. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful. That night, in the barracks, whispered conversations began. "Did you see their boots? All of them have good boots. The guards have wristwatches, every single one. They threw away food. I saw it, leftovers from the kitchen just thrown in the garbage. This last comment brought shocked silence. That can't be right, someone whispered. No one throws away food. I saw it. An entire pot of something, just dumped. The implications were too enormous to process. If they had so much food, they could afford to waste it. Helga's experience at the field hospital continued to demolish her understanding of reality. Lieutenant Thompson worked 18-hour shifts, but she never looked exhausted the way German medical staff did. She had energy, reserves of strength that came from being properly fed, properly rested when off duty, properly equipped. The medical supplies seemed infinite. Bandages came in sealed packages, sterile and disposable. In German hospitals, they'd been washing and reusing bandages for years, boiling them to sterilize them, using them until they fell apart. The Americans used them once and threw them away. The morphine never ran out. The antibiotics were administered freely. There were actual surgical gloves, rubber gloves used once and discarded. The waste was incomprehensible. But it wasn't waste, Helga slowly realized. It was abundance so profound that single-use supplies were more efficient than reusing them. One day, Helga found Thompson in the supply room, doing inventory. Problem? Thompson asked. No, Helga struggled with English. So many supply. How you have this? Thompson looked confused by the question. We request supplies. They send them. Standard logistics. Never. Run out. Run out? Of what? Bandages. No. Why would we run out? In Germany we. Helga couldn't find the words. Not enough. Never enough. Understanding dawned on Thompson's face, followed by something that looked like pity. Your supply lines were being bombed around the clock for 2 years, she said gently. I'm sorry. That must have been hell. Trying to practice medicine without supplies. The sympathy was worse than contempt would have been. Helga had spent 3 years thinking she was serving the superior nation, the stronger power, the righteous cause. And here was this American nurse pitying her like she was a victim of incompetence. The worst part was that she was right. The transport to the main POW camps took several days. And during that time, the German women got their first real look at American logistics in action. The trucks that carried them were new, not refurbished, not repaired, not salvaged from other units, new, fresh off assembly lines that were still running at full capacity, even though the war in Europe was over. Each truck had a radio. Every single one. In the Wehrmacht, radios were precious commodities, carefully distributed, frequently breaking down due to poor manufacturing and impossible to replace. The Americans had them in every vehicle, treated them like standard equipment, which they were. At one stop, Marguerite watched American soldiers refuel the trucks. They had fuel trucks, dedicated vehicles just for carrying fuel, and they didn't measure it carefully, didn't ration it, just pumped it in until the tanks were full and moved on. Germany had been desperately short of fuel since 1944. The Luftwaffe had grounded planes not because of damage, but because there was no fuel to fly them. Tank divisions had stalled not from combat losses, but from empty fuel tanks, and these Americans were running fuel trucks to supply other trucks in a logistical chain that seemed to have no end. One evening, at a temporary camp in Western Germany, an American officer gave a lecture to the POWs. It was meant to be about camp rules and expectations, but he started with context. Captain James Morrison from Detroit, a former economics teacher, stood before 200 German women and decided they needed to understand why they'd lost. I know what you've been told, he said through an interpreter. You've been told we're weak, undisciplined, that we'd break under pressure. Some of you are probably still wondering how we won. He paused, looking at their faces. So let me give you some numbers. Just numbers. Facts. You can decide what they mean. He produced a chart. Total war production, 1,939 to 1,945. Aircraft, United States, 300,000. Germany, 119,000. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Tanks, United States, 88,000. Germany, 67,000. Naval vessels, United States, 8,800 major combat ships. Germany, 1,200. The murmurs grew louder. But here's the important one, Morrison continued. Trucks. Military trucks. United States, 2.4 million. Germany, 345,000. He let that sink in. You see, wars aren't won by the best weapons. They're won by logistics, by the ability to move supplies, feed armies, maintain equipment, replace losses. We could afford to lose aircraft because we could build them faster than you could shoot them down. We could afford to be less experienced because we could train replacements and get them to the front with full equipment. One woman, braver than the others, raised her hand. It was Marguerite. Yes? Morrison said, through the interpreter. But quality. German engineering was, superior. Everyone knows this. Morrison nodded. Your Tiger tank was better than our Sherman, 1-on-1. Absolutely true. But we built 5 Shermans for every Tiger you built, and we had the fuel to run them, and the trucks to supply them, and the radios to coordinate them. Quality matters. But quantity has a quality all its own. He pulled out another chart. Steel production. 1,944. United States, 81 million tons. Germany, 28 million tons. Oil production, 1,944. United States, 1.7 billion barrels. Germany, 34 million barrels. The numbers kept coming, each one more devastating than the last. Wheat production, coal production, copper, aluminum, rubber, synthetic and natural. Every single category showed the same story. American abundance versus German scarcity. The war was lost before it started, Morrison said quietly. Not because your soldiers weren't brave. They were. Not because your equipment wasn't good. It was. But because you were fighting an industrial base that outproduced you 10-1 in some categories. And you were doing it while being bombed around the clock and blockaded from resources. He looked at them with something that might have been sympathy. You were told lies. About us, about your own situation, about what was possible. I'm sorry for that. But those are the facts. That night, Marguerite lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, doing math in her head. She'd been good at mathematics in school. Before the war, she'd thought about studying engineering. Now she calculated ratios, production figures, comparing what Morrison had said with what she'd been told. 5 Shermans for every Tiger. 8 aircraft for every German plane. 7 trucks for every German vehicle. These weren't battles. This was arithmetic. Germany had been fighting an equation it couldn't solve. And every soldier who died after 1942, maybe after 1941, had died not for victory, which was already impossible, but for pride, for ideology, for the refusal of leaders to admit what the numbers made obvious. Helga, in a different camp, was having a similar realization. She'd obtained through quiet requests and helpful American nurses who didn't see the harm medical journals. American medical journals from 1,944 and 1,945. The articles described medical advances she'd never heard of. Penicillin mass production, blood plasma storage and transport, mobile surgical, hospitals with equipment that would be envied by major German hospitals. One article, from late 1944, casually mentioned that American medical supply production had exceeded demand, and the surplus was being stockpiled for post-war humanitarian relief. Surplus. They had surplus. Germany had been cannibalizing medical supplies from civilian hospitals to supply military hospitals. Wounded soldiers had died from infected wounds because there weren't enough antibiotics. Nurses had worked without gloves because rubber was needed for vehicle tires. And America had surplus, Helga thought, about all the boys she'd watched die. 18, 19, 20 years old, succumbing to infections that penicillin could have cured. Dying because their nation was strong and superior, but couldn't produce enough medicine. The anger started then. Not at America. What would be the point? They'd simply been more competent. The anger was directed at Berlin. At the leaders who'd known these numbers, must have known them, and sent a generation to die anyway. The POW camps themselves delivered the final, crushing revelation. Marguerite was sent to a camp near Regensburg. Helga ended up at a larger facility near Stuttgart. Thousands of German women, former Wehrmacht auxiliaries, nurses, communications staff, all gathered in temporary detention while the Protectis, Allied authorities figured out what to do with them. The camps weren't luxury accommodations. They were basic, utilitarian, designed for temporary housing, but they had running water. Hot water, even, though it was rationed to certain hours. They had electricity. They had medical facilities, staffed by both American and German doctors, and they had food. 3 meals a day, every day, adequate calories even if the quality wasn't gourmet. For women who'd spent the last year of the war slowly starving, it was paradise. The daily routine was almost boring. Wake up, breakfast, assigned, duties cleaning, laundry, administrative work, lunch, more duties, or free time, dinner, lights out. No one was beaten. No one was tortured. There were strict rules, but they were enforced with detentions and loss of privileges, not violence. It was orderly, professional, almost bureaucratic in its efficiency. The American guards were young men, many barely older than the women they were guarding. They were professional, maintained proper distance, and seemed almost uncomfortable with the whole situation. One guard, a private from Oregon named Tommy Chen, was particularly kind. His family had emigrated from China, and he'd faced discrimination in America, but he'd volunteered anyway when war broke out. He sometimes shared his ration chocolate with the German women when no one was looking. "You're just kids," he said once to Marguerite, through broken attempts at communication. This wasn't your fault. Marguerite didn't know how to respond to that. In some ways, it was her fault. She'd believed, she'd served, she'd supported the regime, even if she'd never personally hurt anyone. But Chen's casual forgiveness, his willingness to see her as a victim rather than an enemy, was almost harder to accept than hatred would have been. The education program started in summer 1945. American authorities, planning for eventual reintegration, began offering classes: English language, democratic civics, basic economics, history, real history, not the propaganda version. Attendance was voluntary, but most women went. What else was there to do? The history classes were the hardest. An American educator, Professor Elizabeth Warner from Columbia University, had volunteered to teach. She was patient, methodical, and absolutely unflinching about presenting facts. She showed them photographs, documentary evidence, testimonies. The concentration camps. Many of the women claimed ignorance, and some genuinely hadn't known the full extent. The camps had been secret, after all, hidden from the general population, but Warner didn't let them hide in ignorance. "You may not have known," she said. "Many German civilians didn't, but your government knew. Your leaders knew, and they did it anyway. In your name, using resources your nation didn't have. During a war, you couldn't win." She showed them Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. She showed them piles of shoes, mountains of human hair, emaciated corpses stacked like firewood. Some women left the room to vomit. Others sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down their faces. A few, not many, but a few insisted it was propaganda, fake, impossible. Warner let them speak then, quietly presented documentation. Nazi documentation, written in German, signed by German officials, describing exactly what had been done. "You don't have to believe me," she said. "Believe your own government's records." Margaret sat through these sessions feeling like her soul was being systematically dismantled. She'd served the Reich. She'd believed in it. She'd thought she was defending civilization, and it had all been built on lies and mass murder. The shame was crushing. But Warner wasn't interested in shame. She was interested in understanding. The question isn't just what happened, she told them. It's how it happened. How did an educated, cultured nation convince itself to do this? How did the lies become truth? How did ordinary people like you, support a system this evil? Those questions haunted Marguerite more than the photographs. She'd considered herself intelligent, educated, discerning, and she'd swallowed every lie, accepted every excuse, supported every policy, because it had all been wrapped in flags and patriotism and appeals to strength. The Americans, with their casual abundance and professional competence, had shown her what real strength looked like, and it looked nothing like what she'd been taught. By autumn 1945, as the camps began processing releases, the women emerged transformed. Not everyone changed. Some clung to the old beliefs, insisting Germany had been betrayed, that the numbers were lies, that somehow, someday, the truth would vindicate the Reich. But most couldn't maintain that fiction anymore. Marguerite was released in October, sent back to her family in Bavaria with a discharge certificate and a train ticket. The journey home took her through Munich, and she stood on the platform during a layover, looking at the ruins. American engineers were already at work, clearing rubble, stringing electrical lines, organizing reconstruction with that same efficient competence she'd seen in the camps. An American jeep drove past, and she watched it go. The driver was chewing gum, one hand on the wheel, looking bored. Just another day occupying Germany. So casual. So completely, devastatingly normal. Marguerite thought about all the propaganda she'd believed, about the lies that had sustained her through years of war, about the boys who died believing they were heroes. She thought about the numbers Captain Morrison had shown them, the simple, undeniable arithmetic of defeat. And she thought about Lieutenant Thompson, the American nurse who'd treated German soldiers with the same care she'd give her own countrymen, because to her they were just patients, and healing was just her job. That night, in a letter to her sister, Margareta wrote something that thousands of German women were realizing at the same moment. They told us the Americans were weak, that their men were soft, their nation decadent, their soldiers cowards who'd break under pressure. They told us we were superior in every way that mattered, in will, in spirit, in racial purity, in cultural strength. Every single word was a lie. The Americans weren't weak. They were so strong they could afford to be gentle. They weren't undisciplined. They were so organized they made our vaunted German efficiency look like chaos. They weren't cowards. They were so confident they didn't need to prove anything. We lost because we were fighting arithmetic with ideology. Because our leaders chose pride over reality. Because we believed our own propaganda while they built factories and farms and supply chains that buried us under sheer material abundance. The shame isn't that we lost. We deserved to lose. The shame is that we believed the lies, that we never asked the hard questions, that we sacrificed everything for a Reich that was rotten from the beginning. I don't know how to rebuild from this. I don't know how to live with what we've done, what we've supported, what we've allowed, but I know one thing. I'll never accept a comfortable lie again, no matter how patriotic it sounds, no matter how much it flatters my pride. Truth is harder than lies. But it's all we have now. Helga, released a month later, returned to Hamburg and found her hospital in ruins. She stood in the rubble, looking at the shattered building where she'd trained, where she'd worked, where she'd believed she was serving something noble. An American military hospital had been set up nearby, treating both occupation troops and German civilians. They had medicine, equipment, supplies. They had what she'd needed for 3 years and never had. Without really deciding to, Helga walked to the hospital and asked, in broken English, if they needed help. The American doctor in charge looked at her credentials. German nursing certification, 3 years of wartime experience. "Can you start tomorrow?" he asked. She could. Working alongside the Americans, Helga learned modern medicine, real antibiotics, proper sterilization, surgical techniques she'd only read about. She learned from people she'd been taught were inferior, and slowly, painfully, she rebuilt herself into someone who could live with truth instead of comforting lies. The story of German women POWs encountering American forces is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a case study in how propaganda works, how it fails, and what happens when manufactured reality collides with truth. These women weren't monsters. Most of them were ordinary people who'd believed what they were told, who'd trusted their leaders, who'd never had reason to question the narrative they'd grown up with. And that's what makes their story important, because it shows how easily good people can be led to support terrible things, as long as the lies are wrapped in patriotism and pride. The Americans who defeated them weren't superhuman. They were just competent, well-supplied, properly fed, adequately equipped, and fighting for a cause that didn't require them to deny reality. That was enough. More than enough. If you found this story valuable, hit that subscribe button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment about what shocked you most. And remember, the next time someone tells you a comfortable lie about your nation's strength and the enemy's weakness, ask for numbers, ask for evidence, ask for truth. Because arithmetic doesn't care about ideology. And reality always wins in the end. Thanks for watching.